welcome to Books in Action. My name's Melissa Kopecki. I'm the director of the South Orange Public Library, the sometimes host of this show, and have the great pleasure tonight of introducing you to Lora Tazewell, who's a resident of Maplewood, a former resident of South Orange, who has written a children's book, Jelly Bread and Water Juice, and we'll be talking about that whole story and process tonight. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is your first children's book, is it not?
Absolutely, yes.
So can we backtrack a little bit? You grew up not in New Jersey, correct?
No. I was raised in Brooklyn, New York, and I was actually born in Washington, D.C.
So was I.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, small world.
Right, definitely.
So I know that this draws on Brooklyn roots and also Jamaican roots.
Absolutely.
So did you spend childhood time in Jamaica as well?
No, I've spent all of my time in Brooklyn, but the experience in my grandparents' home was almost like being in Jamaica. Back in the 60s, my grandmother's home was like an oasis, and she had a backyard that was just rich in plants and flowers and blooming with everything. And as a child, listening to the sounds and smelling the scents and with the food and everything, it felt like being in Jamaica. So that was my experience. Even though I was not born and raised in Jamaica, my household growing up in my grandmother's home and just the environment and the community had a very strong representation of Caribbean roots.
So that was your grandmother's roots?
That was my grandmother's roots, yes.
And so she told you stories about when she
yes,
was little?
Yes, she told me stories about when she was little, and interesting enough, my mother and my father, my cousins, their friends, all living the Caribbean experience, even though they migrated from Jamaica back in the late 1940s. The house was the Jamaican experience. There was no such thing as being within the United States or living in the United States and living as an American. I mean, we were Jamaican Americans, but the food that we ate, the music that we listened to, the conversations that we had were all of a Caribbean experience. And that's what I experienced from my own childhood memory. So in my mind, in Grandma's backyard, that's where I was, in Jamaica.
So let's talk a little bit about the story. I just one part of my mind is thinking about, what about in the winter?
That's a good question. My grandmother actually brought up most of her plants in the house in the winter, and she was able to maintain her geraniums. And the geraniums are, one type of a flower that lives 12 months throughout the year. They don't bloom all year, but, they maintain their green, lush, beauty throughout the year. So she would move them into the living room by the windows, and the lighting in the living room was amazing. So the geraniums actually grew to be bushes. I mean, these were huge plants that lived and breathed in her living room. And then when the weather would change, I would say, late April, she'd move them back out to the backyard, and she would take them out of the pots and put them back into the ground. And that was her secret of maintaining the geraniums and a lot of the other plants. She just seemed to be really good at doing that.
So did you all end up growing up as gardeners as well?
We did, actually.
Authors,
yes.
artists.
My mother is a wonderful gardener, and I consider myself to be also. I have beautiful flowers at home in Maplewood, and it's perfect living in the Garden State.
Yes.
Because we have so many wide variety of flowers that we can use. It actually reminds me of my grandma, and geraniums are my favorite. So.
That's lovely. I mean, that is something about gardeners, I think. They associate the stories and memories and everything with plants, just as people do with food. Because
Absolutely.
I love that your your story isn't really about food, but that's
No.
the title, and it does draw on that food is the thing that brings us together.
That's right.
So, you have one of my favorite titles,
Oh,
Jelly Bread and Water Juice. I love children's books for their variety of titles. They're really much more fun than adult book titles, and I do like, I've always liked Alexander and the Terrible,
Oh,
Horrible, No
yes.
Good, Very Bad Day.
Yes.
It's a great title. And for a newer one, I Will Never Not Ever Eat a Tomato. But this goes right up there, because I love Jelly Bread and Water Juice.
Oh,
It's
great.
just a lovely title.
uh-huh.
So, what was the inspiration for actually putting this down on paper? All
Okay,
these
well, first,
childhood-
since you talked about the title, I mean, that makes me happy. I've thought of several titles for the book. Jelly bread. In Jamaica, there's a special type of bread, and it's almost like a pound cake texture, and it's called hardo bread. And hardo bread is, you can make sandwiches with it, you can toast it, but it has the consistency and the texture of pound cake. And so that's what I loved. I loved Jamaican hardo bread, and I loved jelly. And that's what I asked for lunch. I asked my grandma to make for lunch every day. Now, water juice. Water juice is almost like orangeade. I don't know if you've ever had Snapple orangeade.
Yeah.
It's just watered down orange juice because, and I'm sure most grandmothers today, I mean, it's a universal theme. Many adults feel as if orange juice is too strong for a children's stomach. The acid is too strong. So you pour some water in and it dilutes it, and it's a little easier for children to digest. And that's what I loved, and whenever I think of that, everything comes back, the place, the setting, the smells, the feeling of being in Grandma's house. And that's the first thing that I associate with my grandma. Every time I see hardo bread, I think of that. So that's why I gave it that title. And then that's how the story wraps up in the end also.
Is that bread that you can find in the South Orange Maplewood area?
You absolutely can. I think there are several Caribbean stores, Jamaican stores, and you can go in and you can order it. And I'd love to have you try it, actually.
Well, see, now I want to.
Great.
So, how did this take place in your head, that needed to become a story that was written out for kids to share?
The interesting thing, I love children's books also. I'm an educational media specialist. I work in Newark Public Schools, and I've worked with literature, since the beginning of my career. And I never thought of myself as being a children's book author, honestly. I kept a journal, and I've always kept a journal. And many times in the middle of the night, I would just wake up and I'd get these inspirational ideas and thoughts, and I would just jot them down. And the text in the book are just snippets of memories of times that I actually used my imagination in my grandmother's backyard. So I remember, for instance, and there's one page in the book that talks about braiding the vines of the grape from the grape arbor.
Illustration.
And the vines in my mind represented the hair of a beautiful Caribbean queen. And I just jotted the notes down, and over, I would say, the period of 2 to 3 years, I put all of my notes together. And that's how Jelly Bread and Water Juice came to be. My grandmother was the most inspirational woman in my life, really. In addition to my mother, of course, whom I love dearly. And I have always known that I would pay some type of tribute to her. And it's just amazing that through inspirational thoughts and dreams that I would able to compile this over a period of 2 to 3 years. And that's how I've been inspired to write this book.
Is your grandmother still living?
No, she isn't.
Oh, but she's loving this.
I do. I absolutely do. And I feel her looking down and just, getting a kick out of this whole thing. Definitely.
Well, and the illustrations, then, there's a whole story behind those as well.
Absolutely.
There must be, seeing as
Yes.
the illustrator is your mother-in-law.
My mother-in-law, Miss Barbara Tazewell, who is an accomplished artist. She's a fabulous mother-in-law as well. And my in-laws are just amazing people. They're all very talented in their own right. But when I've shared the idea of writing this book and using my notes to compile this, my mother-in-law asked me if she could do the illustrations. She, of course, is already a children's book author. She's written several children's books, and she has one book now entitled Ola, the water bearer, that's on display in the African Pavilion of the North Carolina Zoo. And she asked if she can do the illustrations, and I was just so touched and honored that she would offer to do that, because she's very busy. She's involved in so many different creative activities. And so she agreed, and she used a few illustrations. A few of the illustrations in the book are actually based on childhood photographs of me.
Oh, that's
One in
fun.
particular is the second page that has Wawa standing in the garden with the glasses on. That illustration is actually based on a real photograph.
I actually love this illustration. And that would explain it. It's such a little girl with her glasses on standing in a garden. I
Right.
just really like that one.
So I think I gave her two photographs, and I just gave her time. You could never rush the creative process. And over a period of months, based on the text that I would give her, she'd just start sending in these sample illustrations. And it was amazing that, my mother-in-law, who never met my grandmother, was able to really pick up the feel of what it was like in that household, the colors, the textures, and her artwork.
So she was just taking that from your words and just a couple
Exactly.
stray photographs.
Absolutely.
And you were doing this long distance, right?
Yes, long distance, and technology is a wonderful thing. And the illustrations are actually collage style. She
Right.
used various textures, fabric, photographs, and they are three-dimensional. And she was able to scan them in and email them to me, and I would check it off, approve it, and then, maybe here or there make a few minor changes, but it's amazing how simple the process was in that regard.
That's really a very cool thing. I think, the collage part is wonderful. And you can really see, I think, in this one in particular, the photograph in there, it's nice. In some of the illustrations, the seashells are drawings. And in this one,
Absolutely.
it's a photograph.
Exactly.
So, I just love the idea of collaborating over time and space as well.
Yeah.
But we are going to be able to go into this a little bit further, but we're going to have to take a break in a minute. I like the dog too. It's very
Cool.
collagey. And we will come back in a minute and we'll talk a little bit more about the technology that allows you to produce a book like this and to collaborate over long distance. So
Absolutely.
thank you again for being here and talking about it. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
After 17 years working as a mason, Mike was laid off. I met him when he came into the library looking for help. He found a job opening, but the application was only online. Mike said he'd spent his entire life around tools, but had never used a computer. I showed him how, and he ended up applying for numerous jobs online. I saw Mike the other day. His new computer skills paid off. He's working again.
New Jersey libraries are transforming lives. Tell us your story.
Hi, we're back at Books in Action. I'm Melissa Kopecki, and our guest this evening is Lora Tazewell, who's a resident of Maplewood and the author of Jelly Bread and Water Juice for the Picture Book Crowd. We were talking about long-distance collaboration as Laura worked on the illustrations with her mother-in-law living in a different state. So you were talking about how much easier it is with the technology and being able to send scanned
Yes.
illustrations back and forth and email each other and keep in touch that way. Can you tell me a little bit about what technology had to do with the publishing process for
Sure.
you too?
Well, the publishing aspect of it was a little bit more stringent. I used PowerPoint, Microsoft, PowerPoint to actually do my first drafts of the story. And when I wrote the story, I just used clip art, and I placed the clip art in various spots of the book. And then my mother-in-law took those images that I used along with the text, and she created the illustrations. However, the publishing aspect was much more difficult. The pictures had to be, certain DPIs. Everything had to be 300 DPIs. If the measurements of the text was off, the publishing company would send it back. So you can have an almost perfect manuscript that you would assume to be ready for the publishing company, but if one minor detail was off, they would send the entire manuscript back, and then, the process of waiting would take a long time. But when you're thinking about just children's illustrations, just books, children's books in general, the illustrations are so important, and I'm thinking about how long it actually took to get them done, and I'm appreciative that the publishing company would send it back for minor mistakes, because in looking at the illustrations of the book now, they're almost, identical replicas of the original. And it makes me feel wonderful to know that when people see the illustrations, they feel like they're looking at the originals. They can see the three-dimensional qualities in it. So in using technology, it's very, very important that you take the time to make sure that all of the specifications are right, that the color coordinations, the DPIs that you're sending, the one thing that I've learned as well is that through email, you can actually lose resolution from the color of the illustrations. Every time you send a picture through email back and forth, you're losing some of the texture and color. So, my mother-in-law actually had to rescan the original images several times before we can send it back to the publishing company.
So neither you nor the publishing company ever had the originals in your hand? You were only dealing with electronic art?
We were only dealing with electronic art. The originals were scanned images. And, due to just the sophistication of technology today, you can actually scan an original to make it look maybe perhaps even better than the original, because they can add color,
right,
more texture. I'm proud to say that nothing was added, but the color had to match the 300 DPI specifications in order for the company to even print the book. They would not want to be held liable for any problems with the illustrations. So that was the most time-consuming part of this entire process. And I would get so frustrated, because after 2 to 3 years of working on this, there's that part of you that just wants to get it done.
Right.
But you realize that with all of that work, one minor mistake can really mess up a project. So it was a wonderful learning experience, and when I write my next book, I've learned the do's and don'ts of how I should actually send the manuscript for future.
But what a change in the process. I'm sure in your school library you have some books back from
Absolutely.
when the color separation was all done by hand.
That's right.
That was not that long ago, because I grew up reading books that were, the picture books. They'd be a black and white page and then a color page.
That's
because
very
the color
true.
pages were so expensive to produce.
That's very true.
And now when you have the illustrators actually doing their own, not color separation, but, conversion to printing format.
Well, I think that that's also a result of the whole concept of self-publishing. I think that technology has really opened the doors for people to do self-publishing. Without that, You don't have the marketing aspects, you don't have email. An entire aspect of promoting your book would be lost. I mean, think of, as a librarian also, the way people would market books was primarily through publishers. There was no way that you could actually go out there and communicate on your own. But thanks to the internet, you can generate your own email lists. There's Facebook, there's Twitter, there's so many different avenues that you can actually advertise. That technology, in addition to actually producing the book, it provides the avenue for you to market the book as well.
Well, I know when self-publishing first came about, too, before there were internet publishing, self-publishing places, self-publishing was called vanity publishing.
Right.
And it was like, okay, well, you couldn't get a real publisher. And talk about a field under high-speed change.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. One of the New York Times bestseller things was a self-published book.
Absolutely.
Just recently, and I'm forgetting the woman's name, but I mean, just an amazing thing. And if you look at it not as, as that from that old vanity publishing perspective, but for the fact that how much easier it is for real talent and real stories to see the light of day.
Absolutely.
It's an incredible thing.
And for me, I did go the traditional route. I did send my manuscript to publishers, and I was able to get the book in the hands of a reputable book agent in New York. She loved the book. The only problem was that she felt that if I were going to market it to a publishing company, I would have to do it without the illustrations. And the illustrations to me are just as important as the actual text. And how in the world could I turn around and tell my mother-in-law,
Right.
sorry, Mom,
Can't use your
right, we
illustrations.
can't use your
right.
illustrations after all of the hard work. And for me, this was more of a sentimental, personal goal of mine. I've never thought or had aspirations of becoming a children's book author. It was important for me to share my grandmother's legacy with anyone who was willing to share it with me. And I'm so proud of myself that I didn't give in to that. So the opportunities did arise for me to possibly have my book picked up through a traditional publishing agency, but they'd have to pick their own illustrator. I would perhaps have had to change some of the text to make the story more realistic, a true plot where the main character is actually learning a lesson. And for me, Jelly Bread and Water Juice is the story of a child's imagination running wild. I don't think that when children play in their natural elements, they're actually thinking about the lessons that they're going to learn while they're playing. It's like a stream of consciousness when you play.
Did you think a lot about the child who was reading it or hearing it read when you were, as you were putting the story together?
Absolutely.
Taking your pieces of your dreams and your memories?
Absolutely. Working with children, I've worked with children from pre-K all the way up to high school students. And that's absolutely what I was trying to do. I was thinking of the mind of a child and actually trying to go back to that most innocent place within myself, before fear, before experience, quote unquote, and just, recall what it was like to actually just play, to play with no reservations or fear or inhibitions about, okay, I've got to go home and go in the house now and get ready for sleep, and just play. And I think that it's important that children maintain that. And as an adult, I think it's important that we try to find that aspect within ourselves,
Well, it's always a conversation in children's literature about how how much are you writing for the children, and how much are you writing for what you think the children
Right.
want to be hearing, and about reviewing them and stuff too.
Right.
Certainly, that's always a conversation with the best of intents among children's librarians and children's book reviewers. Are we selecting things that we like?
Absolutely.
Are we selecting things that are really great for the kids? And of course, you're aiming to do both,
Exactly.
really, to, have some standards, but
Absolutely.
also be really directing right to the kids. I think one of the things in this is that the kids love little details in
Right.
the illustrations and everything, and that certainly is a wonderful element that was added in.
Wonderful.
Back to the needing to, if you had gone through a traditional publisher, needing to use a separate illustrator. I think a lot of people don't realize that, but that has always been the tradition that,
Right.
the publisher puts together, which still kind of amazes me, and I think most people just don't know, in picture books where the pictures and the words are so much apart. I mean, you can't have
Absolutely.
one without the other, and they're matched completely traditionally by publishers, and it has to be the really top names in writing or illustrating
Absolutely.
who would do the other,
Mhm.
or someone who actually does
Right.
both,
Right.
a writer and an illustrator.
You're absolutely right. And I think that as much as I love children's literature, had I thought about approaching my book from the standpoint of a children's author, I may have taken a completely different approach. But being a librarian and teaching English, for about 10 years, it's important to me that students understand that if you do something, you have to have a passion for it. There's a story that you want to tell, and if you are passionate enough about that story, people will want to listen to it. You can learn the conventions of writing, and you can be a master writer, but if there's no passion in the story, if there's no vision, what is the point? And when I go to Barnes and Nobles and Borders and other bookstores, I look through the books all the time, and I think to myself, you see so many cookie cutter type images, and I'm proud of the fact that we were able to use original illustrations.
That's just a wonderful story, and unfortunately, we're sort of winding down here. I have one more question I want to ask you. Did you run this past your high school students
I
while
did.
you were working
They've
on it?
actually, they were my original audience.
That is just a wonderful thing, and I bet it was wonderful for them to have somebody, have them think about picture books again and bringing that back. You're talking about not losing that capacity to play. I think people shouldn't lose their love of books with pictures ever.
Right, absolutely.
So were they and you terribly excited when they had the hard copy? And
I think they were just so amazed that their, librarian was a children's book author, but they were interested in the process, and I was.
can't imagine a better lesson for them. I
Right.
mean, to see this whole thing and to know what they can potentially do someday too. So thank you very much. I'm sorry, we're out of time.
Oh.
It went way too fast.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for having me.